Today we are talking about the all-important cutting table. And this is cutting table, not cutting instructions. So if you're not putting your cutting instructions in a cutting table already, please start doing that. It is the best way to display kind of these kinds of instructions, even if you only have one size. Tables are just way visually easier for humans to digest. It leaves more white space and it just organizes things much, much better. So if you're not using a table, please consider using one. But even if you are using cutting tables already, there are some things that you can do formatting wise to make them that much easier for your customer to read. And we're going to talk about those things today. So the first thing I want to point out is how important it is to make sure that you have left justified your text. So what you're seeing up here is left justification on all of those cutting instructions. And down at the bottom, we've got it center justified, which you might think is going to give you more white space and kind of make it look prettier because it's all centered in the cell of the table and everything, but it really makes the instructions that much harder to read. And that's because we're usually doing, cut some number of width of fabric strips and then subcut those into some number of squares or rectangles usually, right? And so I've even kind of bolded the cutting instructions, the initial width of fabric strips, so that it's easier to pick out those cut instructions from the subcut instructions. But even so, because we're centering this and that makes kind of where the line starts jump around a little bit, it makes it so much harder to figure out what is the main cut and what is the subcut. So left justify all of your text. And then I always recommend also indenting the subcut instructions so you can see cut, subcut. So here's what it would look like if I didn't indent it. And again, really makes it much more difficult to see where that subcut instruction is coming from. So which strips are they coming from? And it's less important for these ones where you've only got one set of width of fabric strips that you're cutting, but for the ones where you're cutting multiple sets of width of fabric strips, without that indentation, it just turns into like one massive block of text, and it can be difficult to see what is a main cut and what is a subcut. And so indenting is really a helpful visual tool to just make this process a lot easier for your customer. The next tip I have for you is basically contrasting, looking at putting your fabrics across the top versus down the side on a table. And this is one that there's not really a hard and fast rule. Sometimes it's better one way, sometimes it's better the other way. I would say if you've got a bunch of fabrics and only a few sizes, you definitely want to put your fabrics down that left side of the table in that first column. But if you've got 6 sizes and only 2 fabrics, maybe it makes more sense to put the sizes over on that left column like you see here. And you've kind of lost the effect here, right? Because we only have a couple of sizes in this example, but if you've got 6 sizes and 2 fabrics, right, this is going to fit on a page much better and be easier to digest for your customer because you don't have to spread it across a bunch of pages. So this is kind of situational. Use your best judgment, but I would say this is the standard option. I would go with this unless you're having trouble fitting it on the page itself. Then maybe look at a different option. Some other formatting things that you might consider including are checkboxes. So this is really helpful if you want to keep track of where you are in cutting. So you include a little tick box for people to check off as soon as they made the cut. Super helpful, not critically necessary. So I would say it just depends on kind of the format and the types of patterns you're writing. Maybe this is helpful to your customers, maybe it's not. Talk to them, figure out what they like. But if you're going to include checkboxes, you still want to make sure that you keep this indenting for the cuts and subcuts. Too often I will see kind of the checkboxes only on the subcut instructions. And so even if they had the indent to begin with, when they add that box in, since there's no box on the main cut instruction, it still makes it look like it's starting in the same space. And it, again, just makes it much more difficult to see where those subcuts are coming from, which is what you want to avoid. You want to make it super clear what you are subcutting in order to get those final cuts. So let's talk about fabric swatches, which is another thing that I would definitely recommend including in your cutting table because this is going to help your reader make sense of the diagrams a little bit easier, because you're going to use these same colors throughout your assembly diagrams. And so you know that anytime you see this yellow, you're looking at fabric A. It just makes everything organized a little bit better and alleviates you from having to have a section in the beginning of your pattern where you're like, this is going to signify this fabric and this is going to signify the wrong side of this fabric, right? You just use color to show that in your diagrams. But again, with all things, you've got options about how you include these swatches. The kind of 2 main ways that I typically see it are either by coloring kind of the whole fabric cell or by including like a little square swatch at the beginning of the fabric name. If you're going to do this, left justify everything, you want to make sure that these swatches are all lined up in one column rather than, again, jumping around if you can avoid it. Just makes it easier on the eye. If you're going to go with this option, you have to be careful with your text colors, right? So if you have really light fabrics and really dark fabrics, on the light fabrics, you're going to want to use a dark text, and on the dark fabrics, you're going to want to use a light text. So either black or white, generally speaking. That can be a little bit weird because now your formatting is changing a little bit. And so one thing that is nice about kind of the little square swatches is that you don't have to deal with that. You can keep all of your text the exact same color and not have to worry about changing the font color at all. But obviously this is a completely different visual effect, and some people just like this more. I would say I'm probably in that camp, but it really does make it tricky if you're going from, one end of the color spectrum to the other. But I would definitely recommend including a swatch of some variety in your pattern, again, because it just makes it easier to visually match up what fabrics go where in the assembly diagrams that come later in the quilt pattern. In all of these examples, what you'll notice is that I do have a column label. I've already talked about, whether you include that as a column label or actually in the cutting instruction cells themselves, which we saw back in this example, just because when you're not putting fabrics in that first column, there's no good way to kind of have your labels all lined up. And so you end up having to do it this way. If you're going to do that option, I would definitely bold them or italicize them, something to make it stand out from the actual cutting instruction. But there is a whole other video about labeling in quilt patterns, so I will not regale you all of that today. I will just link it here in case you find that helpful. All right, that's all I've got for you today. Make sure you like and subscribe, and I will be back next week with another Tech Tip Tuesday. See ya.